To ensure a safe work environment for all personnel, Bluewater operates an electronic integrated safe system of work, or ISSOW, that manages and oversees all tasks on board an FPSO on a daily basis. This system includes modules for permit to work, task risk assessment, and isolation management. It is important that all personnel understand the system and are competent to use it. This film shall explain the steps required to issue a work permit enabling you to perform a task. Any task that is controlled under ISSOW is subject to a Joint Site Inspection, or JSI. The purpose of a JSI is for the Area Authority and Performing Authority to review the task and work location. This inspection will also assist in identifying any further hazards that may be associated with the task or the location where the task is to be performed. The person conditioning the first part of the work permit is known as the permit applicant. As part of the JSI, and together with the Area Authority or a nominated competent delegate, the appointed performing authority is required to identify the hazards and control the risks associated with the task it is about to undertake, adding control measures and additional information if required. There are 3 permit types: cold work, hot work, and red hot work. The Bluewater Permit to Work manual includes a work categorization chart to help determine the permit type required for the task. Red hot work, for example, is applicable when the task involves a naked flame. Bluewater's installations are classified into 4 zones to determine the degree of potential hazard, where Zone 0 is the most hazardous. Any area not classified as either 0, 1 or 2 is a non-hazardous zone. If an area has 2 hazardous area classifications, the highest level is to be selected. The Hazardous Area Plan integrated in ISSOW can be consulted to determine the hazardous area classification. If the task involves working on electrical equipment, not including electrical tools, the responsible person electrical, or RPE, must countersign the permit. All attachments must be prepared and uploaded to the appropriate permit wherever possible by the performing authority. Once the permit has been conditioned, the performing authority prints off the permit pack, including the attachments, and presents these to the Area Authority for review at the Area Authority meeting. Permits must be submitted to the appropriate Area Authority 24 hours in advance and can be valid for 7 days from initial issue. A Task Risk Assessment, or TRA, is a tool that is used to identify hazards and implement suitable control measures to mitigate the risk associated with a task to ensure the risks have been reduced to an acceptable level. The aim of any risk assessment is to achieve a level that is a LARP, which means as low as reasonably practicable. A LARP is defined as when costs involved in reducing risk further would be grossly disproportionate to the benefit gained. There are 2 levels of TRA. A Level 1 TRA consists of a basic hazard and control selection, whereas a Level 2 TRA also includes the formation of a TRA team, dividing the task into task steps and a specification of initial and residual risk ratings. A TRA team consists of the appropriate area authority, the performing authority, relevant contractors and vendors, a safety rep, and technical authorities if required. The task risk assessment will break the task down into components individually known as task steps. Risk is the likelihood and probability of a hazard being realized. This will be determined by using the Bluewater Risk Classification Matrix. The risk assessment shall record suitable control measures and the people responsible for implementing these measures. This will mitigate the risk to a LARP and is referred to as the residual risk. For tasks that are performed on a regular basis, permit templates can be created. These tasks have been risk assessed with a Level 2 TRA, with the resulting residual risk being determined as a LARP. These templates are endorsed by the department heads and the OIM and are valid for 1 year. The routine permits derived from these templates can therefore be safely and efficiently issued by the appropriate area authority at its discretion, including further documentation such as cost assessments. Note and a routine permit cannot incorporate an isolation confirmation certificate. When a work permit is ready to be issued, the area authority and a performing authority will meet in the permit office to issue and accept the permit. They will discuss the task and the control measures in place. When you accept a permit as a performing authority, you are accepting responsibility to comply with the permit conditions and to inform the area authority on the progress of the task. If for any reason the task changes, you are responsible for stopping the job and informing the appropriate area authority. If during a task a general platform alarm, or GPA, sounds, the work site is to be made safe to do so, and all personnel are to proceed to their appointed muster points and await further instructions. Before you start working on the task, you must complete a toolbox talk with the rest of the work party to ensure everyone fully understands the task and the risk control measures in place, as well as to identify any additional hazards. If you are a member of the work party assigned to a task, you must read and understand the associated permit conditions. You are requested to actively contribute to the toolbox talk, which is part of the permit to work process. You are required to sign the toolbox talk form to state that you have read and fully understand the work scope and the precautions are listed on the associated permit. In case of significant changes to the working environment or work party, the area authority or performing authority can request an additional toolbox talk. If during the work the task changes beyond the conditions of the permit, you are required to stop work immediately and report the changes to the performing authority. If you are the performing authority, you must report directly to the area authority. The area authority will then review if further control measures or a new permit are required to safely manage the changing task. You are not allowed to work outside the conditions stipulated on the permit. Not all tasks can be completed in one shift. If at the end of your shift the task is not finished, you must inform the area authority about the status of the task, plant and equipment involved. As the off-going performing authority, you must provide a brief description of your shift activities. The area authority can then decide whether he wishes to suspend and revalidate the permit for the next shift. Some tasks require the overriding or inhibiting of safety systems. When this is the case, a Safety Emergency System Isolation Inhibit Certificate, or SESIC, will be utilized to record and authorize the necessary inhibits or overrides. The application of a SESIC is recorded by the control room operator and needs to be co-signed by the appropriate area authority. Keep in mind that the impairment to a safety or detection system must be kept to a minimum. Confined space entry is one of the most hazardous tasks in the offshore environment. Before entering a confined space, the safety advisor and area authority are required to test the atmosphere to ensure minimal risk to personnel entering the space. A confined space should be positively isolated to ensure no ingress of services or fluids. To control the initial entry of a confined space, you require a standalone cold work permit. The goal of the initial entry is to inspect and survey the area, which will assist in developing an emergency rescue plan. It is common for an isolation to accompany the permit of a confined space entry. If this is the case, the isolating authority will be issued with a lockout box key to ensure the isolation cannot be altered whilst entrants are in the confined space. Prior to entering a confined space, the atmosphere must be measured. The space to be entered is required to have been drained, flushed, purged and vented to achieve an atmosphere of 20.9% oxygen where applicable, a methane lower explosive limit less than 1% and less than 1 part per million hydrogen sulfide. The safety advisor will perform the initial gas test from outside the space. If the atmosphere is within limits, entry can commence. If not, further cleaning or venting may be required. The entrants are required to wear standard personal protective equipment, as well as an escape set, radio, harness, and an intrinsically safe torch. When working in a confined space, a standby man will be required. The standby man will control the entry into the confined space and inform the central control room about the number of people entering the confined space at any one time. He is required to record and track the people entering and exiting the confined space using a local log. The standby man will maintain radio contact with the entrance at all times during the entry of the space. If for any reason communication is lost, the standby man will attract the entrant's attention by use of an air horn. If communication with the entrance cannot be re-established, the standby man must raise the alarm either by radio, phone, or local MAC point. If a general platform alarm sounds during a confined space entry, the standby man should assist all entrants out of the space and direct them to their appropriate muster points. Certain tasks require gas testing. The purpose of a gas test is to monitor the atmosphere of the working area for oxygen levels and gases or substances that may be flammable, toxic, or harmful. There are two types of gas test: a site gas test and continuous gas monitoring. An initial site gas test is mandatory for confined space entries and red hot work permits, but can be requested for any task by the area authority. An initial gas test has to be completed before work on a task can begin. The results of the gas test are recorded on the work permit. If an area is vacated for any length of time, a repeated site gas test must be performed and recorded. Continuous gas monitoring is undertaken to continually monitor the atmosphere for oxygen levels and gases that may be harmful or flammable. Continuous gas monitoring is mandatory for confined space entry, red hot work, tasks with spark potential in hazardous areas, and tasks involving specific substances. Continuous gas monitoring is undertaken by the performing authority at its worksite for the duration of the task and does not have to be recorded. When being issued a portable gas detector, check that it is within its calibration date, that there is no obvious damage to the unit, and that it functions correctly. If a gas detector goes into alarm during a task, stop all work immediately, and if safe to do so, make the worksite safe and inform the area authority immediately. Portable gas detectors are required to be booked out and returned by the performing authority. At the end of each shift, the worksite and equipment is to be left clean, tidy, and safe. The area authority or competent delegate will check the worksite to ensure this is the case. If the task is incomplete, the performing authority is required to record the status of plant or equipment and why the task is incomplete. The area authority will sign off the permit and decide if any isolations associated with the permit are required to become extended term isolations. If the permit is to be signed off as complete, you are required to give feedback to the area authority and discuss any issues identified during the task. For some tasks, it is necessary to isolate equipment or part of the plant. This may have been identified during permit conditioning or as part of the joint site inspection. If a task requires an isolation, the integrity of this isolation must be checked before the work starts. To determine the minimum level of mechanical or process isolations, a tool called the Hazard Factor Assessment is used. This assessment is based upon a calculation. Once the equipment that has to be isolated has been identified, each line or service that it ties into that equipment must be assessed to identify the minimum isolation standard for each line. If a proposed isolation cannot meet the determined minimum isolation standard, a task risk assessment must be undertaken to determine whether the risk has been reduced to a LARP. This task risk assessment must be passed onshore for HSEQ to review, as well as the appropriate asset manager or nominated delegate. With any isolation, The aim is always to use the highest isolation standard available. The TRA should specifically consider alternatives to simply applying the lower level of isolation. This can include deferring the work or reassessing the work to determine an alternative, less hazardous means of conducting the work. For example, hot work could be substituted for cold work, or special isolation techniques could be used. For example, freezing plugs or continuous purge, shutting down a system or a subsystem. Before breaking containment into a sealed system, a further pressure check may be required. Integrity checks on an isolation must be completed by a competent Bluewater isolating authority, ensuring that no sources of energy exist within the boundary of that isolation. Before the work starts, a competent isolating authority is to prove the isolation to the work party. Piping and instrument drawings are used to identify the isolation boundaries. P&IDs must be coloured to assist the correct application of isolations. The equipment that is to be isolated must be highlighted orange. Locked open valves have to be highlighted green, whilst locked closed valves must be highlighted red. Positive isolations such as blanks or spades will be highlighted blue, with bleed valves being highlighted purple. All isolated pipework must be highlighted yellow to assist in the easy identification of the isolation boundary. A corresponding isolation confirmation certificate, or ICC, will list the tag numbers highlighted on the marked up P&ID. Prior to breaking containment of a system that has contained hydrocarbons or substances that are harmful or toxic, it is necessary to drain, flush, purge and vent, also known as DFPV. The area authority is required to devise a DFPV method statement to ensure that the system or plant that is to be worked on has no residues that may cause harm to personnel, environment or plant when breaking containment. To determine the correct level of DFPV, the user is required to consult the method statement. This statement does not deal with specific work scopes, so it is important to consider the possible hazards in each specific case. The level of DFPV is determined by the nature of the hazards that the work presents and represents the cleanliness that needs to be achieved. When certain equipment or part of a plant requires to be isolated, the area authority will nominate a competent isolating authority to apply the isolations. The area authority and isolating authority will review the ICC and the marked up P&IDs together and agree on the various points to be isolated. The relevant isolation tags can then be printed off. When different types of isolations are required, there is a specific order in which these have to be applied, starting with electrical, then valve or mechanical isolations, and lastly positive isolations. When de-isolating, the same order is to be applied, but in reverse. Once an isolation is authorized by the area authority, it can now be applied as detailed in the ICC. For example, a valve may be required to be placed in a closed position. When the actual isolation has been applied, the isolation points must be secured and tagged on site by the isolating authority. This is to ensure no unauthorized changes can be made to the isolation point. As soon as the site is properly tagged, the isolating authority returns the remaining tags to the permit office, where they will be placed in a lockout box. He will then sign to state that the isolations have been applied. When all identified isolations have been applied, the area authority will authorize the ICC for the actual work on the plant or equipment to commence. When isolated equipment is not to be worked on for an unspecified amount of time, an extended term isolation, or ETI, is applied. Equipment that is either redundant or mothballed is not to be placed into ETI. If an isolation envelope includes a lock open or lock close valve, any change of status to these valves must be correctly recorded. The isolating authority will obtain the key from the area authority to allow the position of the valves to be changed. When a lock open, lock close valve has changed position, this should be recorded in the locked open or lock close register. Starting work on mechanical or process isolation may involve breaking containment. There are two significant hazards associated with breaking containment: unidentified leakage and pressure buildup within an isolation envelope. Both these occurrences can cause serious harm if not noticed in time. Before breaking containment, pressure buildup within the isolation envelope must be checked. Pressure buildup can be verified by local pressure or level gauges or opening bleed points. If pressure buildup is noted, work is to be stopped immediately. Make the workplace safe and warn the area authority at once. The area authority shall then reassess the isolation scheme. Before breaking containment, a minimum of 2 isolation points must be checked within the isolation envelope. Once all the isolations are in place and the integrity of each isolation point has been proven, the area authority or isolating authority must determine with what frequency to check the bleed points during the work scope. Once this is done, work can begin. When all the necessary work has been completed, the isolated plant or equipment can be de-isolated. De-isolation involves the removal of the isolation tags and securing all devices from the process isolation. Note that this does not involve the reintroduction of process fluids. When an area authority has authorized the de-isolation of equipment, the isolating authority will take out the ICC, which details the isolation points that are to be de-isolated. Only the isolation points for which de-isolation has been requested will be de-isolated. The isolating authority will cross-check the ICC to ensure that he hasn't missed a point of isolation. When the isolating authority returns to the permit office, the area authority must ensure that the isolation tags from the field match the tag copies in the lockout box and the isolation points on the ICC. The de-isolation of the isolation points will then be signed off in the ISSOW. Reinstatement involves the physical change of the condition of the de-isolated plant or equipment. To be able to authorize the removal of the isolations within ISSOW, all the associated work should be complete or left in a safe condition. The permit should be signed off accordingly. Upon completion of the task, the plant or equipment is required to be de-isolated and recommissioned. In case of a master isolation, all associated permits are required to be signed off. ISSOW does not allow de-isolation of any ICC until all associated permits have been signed off. Recommissioning involves the reintroduction of process fluids and the alignment of equipment to operational status. The area authority may request that the equipment or plant is subject to a sanction to test, or STT, to check its functionality. In case of a sanction to test, the area authority will suspend all permits that are associated with the isolated equipment. The performing authorities are required to hand in their lockout box keys to the area authority. The area authority will then authorize the removal of the isolation points as identified on the ICC. Sanction to test is not permitted on hydrocarbon systems. Based on the outcome of the test, the area authority can choose to re-isolate the system or to reinstate it and close out the associated work permits. When an isolation has to be relocated several times as part of a fault finding or testing equipment, a personal isolation record, or PIR, may be used. The point of isolation is to be tagged and needs to be continuously manned, contained, or enclosed. A PIR is valid for one shift only. If the isolation will exceed one shift, it must be transferred to an ICC. Using a single valve to isolate a hazardous system must be subject to a hazard factor assessment. If the worksite is left unattended for any period of time, however short, the integrity of the plant must be restored. Note that isolations, work scope and reinstatement must be carried out by the same person. If an isolation scheme cannot physically meet the requirements stated by the appropriate hazard factor assessment, a risk assessment will be undertaken to ascertain if the task can be completed safely. This risk assessment must be reviewed by onshore and if found to be suitable and sufficient, a deviation permit will be issued permitting the work to go ahead with a non-standard isolation. When a permit has an ICC as an attachment, a lockout box key must be provided to each performing authority to ensure that the isolation scheme cannot physically be changed whilst personnel are working on isolated plant or equipment. Bleed points ensure that there is no pressure build-up within a mechanical and process isolation envelope. The area authority will determine a specific frequency with which to check the bleed points, but as a minimum they should be checked once per shift. During normal operations, the bleed point should remain in the closed position. If a pressure build-up is noticed when opening a bleed point, the task should be stopped immediately and the area authority should be informed.